Hi everybody, this is Sebastian Gorka, broadcasting here from the Gun Dude in Falls Church. We're putting together a package, a kind of briefing package, if you will, that is revolving over or around the concept of knowledge as power. It's been a scary few days in the world generally. It's not just about events happening in the Middle East, the events happening in Africa, but it's events happening in Europe, in the territory of one of our oldest allies, the French Republic. You've seen all the news broadcasts, you've seen the videos, the horrific footage. People mowed down in a concert hall. You've seen people attacked at a restaurant, bombs exploding outside a soccer stadium. Well, what do? What is the response of a citizen who's concerned that they could become involved in some kind of attack here in America? We have a history. It's not just 9/11. It's the Fort Hood shooter. It is the Boston bombing. It is Garland, Texas. We don't want to focus here on just objects, on weapons. We want to help you to understand why we are where we are today and to prepare yourself. Really, it is about knowledge as power. So we're going to have a colleague of ours speak to you a little bit later, who is a national security professional from the operational and tactical level. He's going to talk about the very concrete things you can do to make yourself better aware of the threat around you every day as you go around your business, as you go from work, you go shopping, you take your children out to some sporting event, what you need to be aware of, what you need to be looking for, and the measures you can take concretely to make yourself, your loved ones, safer. So we'll have that from our colleague in a moment. But first, let me try and set the stage for you. Let's give you the context of the violence so that we understand what's really going on and what's driving it. So I'm Sebastian Gorka. I have a position with the Marine Corps University. I teach our devil dogs around the nation, even out in places like Okinawa, Camp Lejeune, you name it. But I also have a company called Threat Knowledge Group with my wife, Katie Gorka, and we support various elements of the U.S. government, Special Operations Command, the U.S. Army Special Operations Command in Bragg, and also the FBI and elements of the intelligence community. And we specialize on what we call the threat doctrine of global jihadism, a fancy label, a military label for understanding what the enemy believes, what their strategy is, and how they intend to achieve their objectives. Because one of the most dangerous things we can do is to just say, they're crazies. They have no plan. This is just random. This is just violence for the sake of violence. This is like a gangbanger sticking his MAC-10 out of the window and pulling off some rounds as he drives down around his neighborhood. No, nothing could be further from the truth. This isn't about random violence. This is about systematic, planned campaigns to strike at the heart of everything we hold dear in the West and this great nation of the United States. So let me tell you a story. Let's talk about where this all began. After World War II, there was a man, a minor government official in the Egyptian government, and his name was Syed Qutb, Q-U-T-B. Remember that name. He was invited to America to come and study us, to look at our political system, our educational system. And he lived here, traveled the country, lived in Colorado, lived in Washington, lived in California for 2 years. This man saw himself as a devout Muslim, a follower of Allah and a believer of what is written in the Quran. In studying Americans closely, he came to a very stark conclusion. This man, Syed Qutb, decided that America is a godless, sex-obsessed, materialistic civilization. Not only did he conclude that about America in the 1950s, no less, When he left our country and went back to Cairo, he made a decision. And he made a decision to destroy us. He said, we are so heretical, we are such an affront to everything he believed in his version of Islam, that we must be crushed. This man decided to sit down and pen a book whose title in English is Milestones, sometimes called Signposts Along the Way. This book isn't some weird, cranky book from 60 years ago. You should understand that this book, Milestones, that you can find on my website in English, go to thegorkabriefing.com and please check it out. This book needs to be understood as the FM of global jihad, the field manual, the military manual of jihad. And this book has been found on high-value targets, what the intelligence community calls HVTs, around the world, whether it's commanders of Al-Qaeda, whether it's terrorist leaders here in America, in Syria, in Iraq. This book is their Bible. They carry this as their manual. And let me just give you two sound bites to make you understand the significance of this text. The first one is a definition of Islam that Qutb uses more than 20 times in this thin little book. He says, I'm a Muslim and my readers are Muslims. And you need to understand one thing, my brothers. Islam isn't just a religion. It's not what you do at home 5 times a day when you pray or when you go to the mosque on Friday. Qutb said that Islam is a political movement with a global mission to reinstate the caliphate, the empire of Islam across the world for the glory of God. It's not just about freedom of religion or freedom of practice of religion. It's about a supremacist political movement. And he said, if you're a Muslim, you have to help me recreate the empire of Islam for the glory of God. One more concept from the book that has great relevance to the security of this nation. There is an idea, a theological concept in this religion called al-wala al-bara. Al-wala, A-L-W-A-L-A, al-bara, A-L-B-A-R-A. Originally, this simply means, in the Islamic theological context, do that which Allah likes and reject that which displeases him. Which every religion could say, do what Buddha likes and distance yourself from things that Buddha wouldn't do. Or do what Jesus would do, and reject that which Jesus wouldn't like. But people like Qutb, the people we call the jihadi masterminds, operationalized this concept. And they turned it into the following. They said, if you're a Muslim living on land that isn't the caliphate, isn't controlled by Muslims, isn't run in accordance with the Quran, you have only 2 options in life. Option number 1, you must leave that infidel land, wherever it is, even if it's Minnesota or whether it's Cairo. If the Egyptian government isn't following the Quran, you've got to get out of there. You've got to leave and you've got to go and live on the land of the caliphate, run by the Emperor of Islam. If you don't, if you refuse to leave the infidel land, you have one more option. You must grab a weapon and kill the infidel. So, in English, if you're not living on the territory of the caliphate, you must emigrate or you must kill the infidel. You must kill us. Why is this important? Because that's exactly the choice that was made by Nidal Hasan, the Fort Hood shooter, by the terrorists of Garland, Texas, and by the Tsarnaev brothers who placed those pressure cooker bombs at the Boston Marathon. That is a concept that is alive today, 60 years later. Second man you need to be familiar with, who is really up there amongst the masterminds of the global jihadi movement, is a Jordanian called Abdullah Azzam, A-Z-Z-A-M, Azzam. And he's important for two reasons. Number one, he's the real creator of Al-Qaeda. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, this man looked at that relationship or that event and he said, we have an infidel nation, the Soviet Union, invading Muslim soil. That requires jihad, that requires a military response. But the Afghans are too weak, too small to defeat this infidel invader. So he said, I've got to recruit helpers. I've got to recruit jihadis from around the world to come and be trained in Pakistan next door, and then to deploy into Afghanistan to help the Afghans destroy the infidel Russians. That organization that he created was called the Arab Services Bureau, very neutral sounding name. And guess who he hired as his deputy? A certain young Saudi Arabian called Osama bin Laden. That organization existed for the next 10 years, recruited more than 50,000 foreign fighters to deploy into Afghanistan. And when Azzam was eventually assassinated in Pakistan, guess who inherited his organization of more than 50,000 jihadi fighters? Yes, it was Osama bin Laden. And at that point, he changed the name of the organization to Al-Qaeda. But what's the full meaning of that word? We don't talk about the full meaning of the name Al-Qaeda. The full name of this organization is The Base. That's what Al-Qaeda means. But the full name is The Base for the Propagation of Jihad, Holy War, against the Jews and the Crusaders. So you can tell what he was interested in, not just fighting Russians in Afghanistan, but taking the war to Americans and to Israelis. And that's how the modern Al-Qaeda is born. But the second reason is even more important. This man, Abdullah Azzam, was very qualified as a theologian. He actually had a PhD in Islamic jurisprudence from the most important Sunni institution in the world. It's called the Al-Azhar in Cairo. It's a kind of Vatican, if you will. They don't have a pope for Sunni Islam, but they have a Vatican called the Al-Azhar. And he had a PhD from the Al-Azhar, which meant he was authorized to issue fatwas, to issue religious decrees. And back in '79, when that war began, he issued probably the most important fatwa the world has seen in terms of jihadi mobilization until last year. That fatwa, 25 pages long, you can read an English language translation again on my website, The Gorka Briefing. That's G-O-R-K-A, thegorkabriefing.com. That fatwa, called Defense of Muslim Lands, said something quite stunning. He said, jihad is now a universal and individual obligation of all believers. If you're a Muslim, according to this decree, you can't let somebody else fight your wars for you. If you are a Muslim, you must be a holy warrior. You must grab a gun and you must kill infidels. Now, how did he make that argument? What a change. What was his logic? Well, it was a pretty sound one. He said, look what's happened. The infidels, this time the Soviet Union, had invaded Muslim soil, Afghanistan. And you, Mr. Muslim, whether you're sitting in Damascus or you're sitting in Boston, you're waiting for the Muslim world, for the emperor, the caliph, to declare war. You're waiting for the caliphate to send you your deployment orders. But of course, that's not going to happen. Because as Azzam reminded his readers, there is no Islamic empire at the moment because it was dissolved in 1924. The caliphate, the original caliphate, which existed for more than 1,000 years, in its latest version was the Ottoman Empire, run out of Istanbul. But it was dissolved as a consequence of World War I because the Ottomans had been on the wrong side of that global conflict. So he said, look, there is no emperor right now, there is no caliph, there's no imperial command authority. So there is nobody to declare war against the Russians, and you will never get your deployment orders as a result your obligation is to grab a gun and kill the infidel. That document is the most important jihadi mobilizational document until something very, very, very important happened last year in the city of Mosul in Iraq. So, who is ISIS? What is ISIS? How is it different from Al-Qaeda, for example? Well, let's say that if there is a JV team, it's not ISIS. If there is a JV team, it's actually Al-Qaeda today. And ISIS is actually going to the Super Bowl. Let me talk to you about this threat. ISIS is more powerful than Al-Qaeda for multiple reasons. First one is that it's not just a terrorist group, it's actually a transnational insurgency. Al-Qaeda never functioned as an insurgency. It was actually a terrorist group that attached itself to various pre-existing insurgencies. For example, in Somalia, it attached itself to Al-Shabaab, who you may have heard of. In Afghanistan, of course, it attached itself to the Taliban. It couldn't generate tens of thousands of fighters, so it just exploited pre-existing insurgencies. Not ISIS. ISIS recruited its own base of fighters. Today, unclassified estimates put it of upwards of 65,000 jihadis under the control of ISIS today, just in the Middle East. And of course, the real marker of success is that they hold territory. ISIS today holds more territory in multiple countries, Syria, Iraq, and now even Nigeria, believe it or not. They hold more territory today than is the size of the territorial expanse of the Kingdom of Great Britain. So they're bigger than the UK. That's a marker of success. Second thing you need to know about ISIS is that they are the richest threat group of their kind ever. The Financial Times just did an in-depth analysis of the last 12 months, and ISIS netted, in terms of income, $500 million in the last year, from illegal oil sales, kidnapping, extortion, you name it. If you look at just two events in the last 2 years, twice they raided the Iraqi National Bank, ISIS did. And after the second raid, they walked away with $823 million in cash. If you look at how much bin Laden paid for the 9/11 attacks, it's in the great 9/11 Commission report, bipartisan congressional report. The 9/11 attacks cost bin Laden $500,000. The whole thing, from visas to safe houses to flight schools, $500,000. ISIS has 1,600 times that amount of money from just 2 bank raids. So if they get serious about bringing the fight to America, they could make 9/11 look like a small incident. And the third reason ISIS is clearly not a JV player is how effective they are at recruiting their fighters, their jihadis. In just the first 12 months of renewed ISIS operations in Iraq, the unclassified estimates are that they have recruited 22,000 foreign fighters. That's on top of Iraqis and Syrians. That's people coming from all over the world. And the bad news is, of the 22,000, at least 4,000 are Westerners. They're Americans, Brits, Germans, French citizens. As a result, you have to ask yourself a question. When these people fight in theater, when they learn how to use a Kalashnikov effectively, when they learn how to turn an artillery shell into an improvised explosive device, what are they going to do if ISIS sends them back home? Well, think about Paris. Think about those people who are very skilled in the use of basic infantry tactics in a milieu, in an environment of unarmed civilians. And lastly, most important of all, we have what I mentioned a little bit earlier, what happened last June in the Grand Mosque at Mosul. We have the commander of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the chief of this threat group, decide to, after he captured the city, walk into the Grand Mosque at Mosul, dressed in black, wearing the cloak of a religious leader, and declare the re-establishment of the caliphate, the re-establishment of the Empire of Islam after 90 years of absence, with himself as the emperor, as the leader. Now, we need to understand this isn't just some crazy, statement, some empty words. For 90 years, the extremists, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood starting off in the 1920s, or whether it was Al-Qaeda in the 90s or the 2000s, they've all been trying to recreate the caliphate, to re-establish the Empire of Islam. But all of them failed. Every single one. ISIS didn't talk about re-establishing the caliphate. They just went and did it. And they hold territory. They're continuing to kill people, even Muslims who disagree with them, and they're expanding. My analysis, which will be published, it's a report written by myself and my wife, which will be published this Monday at our commercial site, thethreatknowledge.org, threatknowledge.org, gives you an in-depth analysis of the threat to America. Before we transition to our other speaker who will talk about what you can do to prepare yourselves, let me just give you a couple of statistics. In the last 20 months, 82 people have been arrested or killed on US soil as members of ISIS, who are preparing plots or who are going to join ISIS. 82. The bad news is only half of them wanted to go and fight in the Middle East. 20% were facilitators, talent spotters, recruiters. But a full 29%, almost a third of all those arrested, had decided that there was no need to leave America to serve ISIS. They had decided that the best way to serve the new caliph, the new emperor, would be to kill Americans on US soil. So, the question as to whether there could be ISIS-type attacks, as we saw in Paris, on US soil, is not an if question, it is a when question. If you look at the frequency of ISIS arrests in America, we are arresting now 3 times as many ISIS supporters per month in America than we used to be arresting Al-Qaeda terrorists on average per month. 3 times as many. Which is good news because we're finding them and arresting them, but it's also bad news because ISIS is managing to recruit 3 times as many jihadis on US soil. So, before we get operational, before we get tactical, talk about what you need to be aware of every day as you're living your life. Remember one thing. The jihad is real. The global jihad is coming here, is already here, if you look at those 82 arrests. They will try again, and as a result, it really is your responsibility to try and do something about it if you're involved in an incident where calling 9/11 may not be enough, as it was not enough in Paris. The enemy is not crazy. They're not irrational. They're not spontaneous. They have a plan, and you owe it to yourself, to your family, to your colleagues, your loved ones, to familiarize yourself with that plan. Check out the books by Qutb. Check out the fatwa by Azam on my website. And lastly, in case you didn't know, the bad guys actually have an English language magazine. Imagine that. Al-Qaeda had their magazine called Inspire that had things such as the recipe for the pressure cooker bomb that was used by the bombers in Boston. Good intelligence for you to be aware of when you want to protect yourself. But ISIS has their own version, much slicker, called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q, Dabiq. Check it out. It's in English. It's their inside game plan for how to take the fight to us. Read it. It's like seeing the inside of the Nazi general staff during 1944. That would be priceless. This is priceless now. It's in English. It's unclassified. Google it. Knowledge is power. Prepare yourself. Be aware. That's the message from me, Dr. Gorka, from my friends here, Joshua, Jeremiah, Jenna here at the Gun Dude. It's been a real honor, a real pleasure. Stay frosty. Watch your six.
Hello. Thank you for joining us this evening. I want to thank Dr. Gorka, who you just heard, for his valuable insights from his wealth of experience. I also want to thank Josh from the Gun Dude for hosting us and providing this very valuable information to you. You can find Dr. Gorka on the website www.thegorkabrief.com and as well as thegundude.com. A slight introduction about me. My name is Rick Kirschner. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of Curric International. We are a company in which focuses on threat detection. And we're going to talk a little bit this evening about what is threat detection. And really it's about how you can protect you and your family and yourself as a citizen. In my past 25 years of law enforcement and security, both in the private industry and the public industry, I had an opportunity to work in different disciplines, whether it's executive protection. I was also a anti-terrorism officer, special agent for the Department of Defense, as well as a counterintelligence officer. I culminated my career as the Director of Office of Threat Detection at the United States Pentagon. And one of the things that I realized in each one of those varying disciplines is that the adversary all act in the same capacity, in the same way, prior to an attack. And we ask ourselves, how can we protect ourselves? How can we prevent these bad acts from happening? Well, as you know, we must know our enemy. And by studying our enemy and knowing how they act and must act, we can therefore identify them prior to these bad acts. So when I went through my career as executive protection, as anti-terrorism officer and counterintelligence officer, we realized that the adversary had to collect information prior to some level of targeted violence, whether it was on an individual or whether it was on a facility or a very high value target, say the Pentagon, the White House, the Capitol building, or a power plant, or simply even as criminals we know will do the same thing. I would ask, if a criminal wanted to break into your home, what does he do? That's right, he cases the joint. Okay, he wants to see, do you have a dog? Do you have an alarm system? Are there lights? Is there anybody home? Well, terrorists act in the same way. And if you understand that, and you know that, and you can identify that prior to the attack, you as a citizen can help us identify these individuals and what they're targeting and how they're targeting. So, with that understanding, I want to break it down to give you the confidence as a citizen and possibly law enforcement, if you're watching this video, or even non-law enforcement security personnel. What does it look like? How do they act? What am I looking for? And then how do I report it? So we understand that every single terrorist event that has occurred and ever occurred is preceded by reconnaissance or hostile surveillance. And what does that look like? We know the terrorist attack cycle, but I'm going to get into what a terrorist hostile surveillance cycle looks like. First, the surveillant needs to have a target list. And this is the hostile surveillant. And I want you to keep this in mind. This is not the attack team. This is not the individuals that are going to go out with the AK-47s or conduct the attack. This is the hostile surveillant. Many times the hostile surveillant might be a female, as exampled in the Charlie Hebdo attack. It was interesting following that attack that we had a female that was missing prior to the attack, or after the attack we were looking for. She conducted all the hostile surveillance for that particular attack. So what does that look like? They have a target list, and they get that target list possibly possibly, much like Hebdo, through various means such as the Inspire magazine, of which the editor was a part of that target list. It was recommended through leadership. So they go out and they have 5 targets of value that they want to look after. They will need to go out and conduct what's called initial surveillance. What does initial surveillance look like? Initial surveillance is, from a hostile surveillance standpoint, is I need to find out where this location is, the general characteristics of it. It's a 5-story building. It's located at 3rd and Main. The main entrance faces north. There's a parking garage underground. And I need to do this at every one of these 5 locations that we intend on attacking. That information is then sent back, and the leaders and the planners for this attack look at that and say, okay, do these facilities, A, are they vulnerable? Do they meet the needs of what we're trying to achieve? And then can we actually pull it off? Okay? So they'll reduce that list down to, say, 3 or 4, or maybe 1 or 2. And they'll tell the hostile surveillant, we need you to go back and now collect detailed surveillance. And what does detailed surveillance look like? Detailed surveillance, now they must understand how many cars go in and out of the garage. How high is the garage roof if we need to go underneath? Our cars are allowed to park out front. We need to know the distance from the front door to the sidewalk in the event that we want to park a large vehicle-borne IED in front of the location. All these details. How many people in the building? What is the security forces like? Are they armed? Are they not armed? What is their complacency level? At what level, what's their attention level? What is it located near? How thick is the glass on the front? This is detailed surveillance. What does it look on the inside? How far can I go inside this building without being stopped? Can I get on the elevators and go up to the 5th floor? All of these things are then collected. That information is now sent back to the planners. Those planners then decide on one target. With that target, it's sent back to the hostile surveillant. The hostile surveillant then is required to go back. Now we need to understand your patterns of life. We need to understand what is the highest times, the most people that come in and out of this facility or this location, the place where you might be working. Is it 8 o'clock in the morning? Do lines form up outside? How easy is it to get in during that time? What did the badges look like to get into this facility? How far can I get in? How often can I be around there? That is detailed surveillance. That information is sent back. And from that, then they plan, because now they've found a vulnerability. They found a vulnerability. For this example, let's just use the fact that they can get into the underground garage with a large VBID and not be found, not be noticed. Because one thing that's going to be key, and you're going to hear throughout, is the bad guy does not want to get caught. Okay? So they found that vulnerability. Now they're going to plan on how they're going to conduct this attack. Are we going to use backpacks with explosives? Are we going to use a combined arms attack with multiple weapons, with multiple individuals? Are we going to use, again, a VBID? That is then put together. The hostile surveillant goes back to that location before the attack, maybe days, just to make sure that all the vulnerabilities that they had discovered are still there. Yep, everything's the same. Nothing has changed. We are a go. And then the hostile surveillant many times will continue to watch that target, even right up to the time of attack, using a cell phone, contacting the attack team. Everything's a go. It's time to go. He gives the signal, and they deploy. At this stage of the game, if you have not recognized any of that hostile surveillance that has occurred prior to, the possibility of you stopping that attack is almost nil. The attack occurs. The hostile surveillant many times will witness the attack. Many times they will videotape the attack to use as propaganda. and escape and fight another day. That hostile surveillant is who we're going to talk about today and what we're looking for. Now I ask you, where in that entire cycle do you think, as a citizen, as a security officer, as a law enforcement officer, where would you be best suited to identify these individuals conducting this type of reconnaissance, pre-attack operations? You got it, all the way through. Look at the number of times that these individuals are in your face or on your property. So what I'm going to talk about now is, what does that look like when those individuals are in those locations? What are they doing specifically? Because this will give you the confidence and the capability to then report it, because you know what it looks like. And this is really easy, ladies and gentlemen. This is about normal and not normal. You, in your place of your employment, where you work. You know where you work, you know what it looks like. No different than what's around your home. You know what's normal. You know that this van that's parked on the end of your street is not normal. And you have that capability to say, that's not normal. What's that guy doing? It's all in us. The same way at work. You know that everybody that comes in and out of the building, what they look like, what the general ideas of how people move, what they do. So what I'm going to speak about right now are 8 different things that these individuals do and how they conduct hostile surveillance. First is, we should be aware of, is loitering or watching. Just simply watching. An individual that's in an area, particularly a sensitive area, that you know individuals do not routinely just stand, that could be a reason for further observation of this individual. Why is that individual at that bus stop when 4 buses went through and he never got on? That's odd. That's unusual. Okay, on the street corner, or possibly walking in front of the building several times. Walk from one end of the corner to the other. Okay, having a fixation on the front of the building. Secondly, would be videography and photography. Probably one of their favorite, because they're able to capture that intelligence that they need to plan the attack. They're able to use that in that planning phase. So videography, and while many of us, at least in the National Capital Region, you know, there's lots of tourists. We know what the tourists look like. They take pictures of. They take pictures of themselves. Selfies in the background is the Capitol building. But why would somebody take a picture of a fire truck or a fire hydrant? Why would somebody take a picture of CCTV cameras? Why would they have such an interest in that? And panoramic views, taking a panoramic view of the entire area, or a picture of a parking lot, or a security booth. Why would somebody take a picture of that? You have to listen to that. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so also, let's talk about another thing, unusual questions. You might get unusual questions. How many armed guards on the shift? Hey, do you guys have long guns? Do you have bulletproof vests? What are the fire alarm procedures for this building? This column here, is it a support column? No, they might not ask you directly that, but those types of interesting questions. You might see somebody taking notes. Sketching, just the old-fashioned look at a location, sketch it out. Entrances and exits into a location, sketching those types of things. Another method is what we call probing. And that's where an individual tries to discover or test the security measures. Can I get into this building without using a badge? Can I get on the elevator without anybody noticing? And can I get into the building? Or possibly a physical security barrier. Can I defeat this physical security barrier? And how do I do that? Okay. Another thing, they need to figure out the logistics of the location. How far away is the front door from the sidewalk? So simply measuring. And how would we do that? I put my back against the wall and I take 15 paces out to the corner, and I now know that, hey, I have 15 paces and I know the distances about things. How wide is the door? Trying to get these types of logistics. And then also timing. Again, we know through a number of case studies, understanding when the high times of most of the traffic, vehicle traffic, or foot traffic into a location. Understanding that. If you see somebody watching a physical security barrier, or what we call a delta barrier, and it lowers, and he watches it, and it takes 5 seconds to go down, and it takes 9 seconds to go up, and an individual looks at his watch, writes that down, and walks off. That's something that individual needs further observation. So I'm going to offer to you, well, what do I do if I see these types of things? Because it is crucial as American citizens for us to collectively work together and be the eyes and ears and understand who our adversary are and how do we report that. You have to have the confidence of knowing what that individual is doing, what he has done, he or she has done, is unusual. And you need to listen to that gut feeling. Listen to that sixth sense, that hair that stood up on the back of your neck because you saw something unusual. Yes, we do have a program. If you see something, say something. We need to really institute that. If you see something, you now have the confidence to say something. Understand, what you're doing is protecting and preventing. That individual may be approached. If you have a security officer or law enforcement nearby and you explain, this is what I just saw, this is what I just experienced, you have an opportunity as a citizen to then have that individual approached. If it's no problem and that individual is there legitimately, it shouldn't be an issue. That law enforcement officer can then question, sir, we noticed that you were doing this, you were doing X, that's unusual. Can you explain your reasoning for being here, sir? If they're legitimate, it's no problem. But oftentimes that type of information is then passed down, those identifications are taken, and also that individual that is conducting hostile surveillance realizes that, hey, I'm about to get caught, or I could get caught. And they might go on to another location or another place, or it summarily will prevent a bad occurrence from happening. I want you to understand, particularly those in the area of which we live here, in the National Capital Region, the 5 top cities in the Mid-Atlantic of which law enforcement have had interaction with those known in the terrorist databases. And this is a standard stop. An individual has a headlight out, he gets pulled over, they run their names, and because they are in the system, they're identified as being on a watch list of sorts. The 5 cities, I wondered, do you know, or could you guess what they might be? Some say New York, many say Washington, D.C. Annandale, Vienna, Fairfax, Alexandria, and these 5 locations. So understand, these individuals are in our neighborhoods. Many times we connect the dots after a terrorist attack or a terrorist event, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation have done a fabulous job of getting individuals to think that they are working for their Al-Qaeda or ISIS, in which in fact they're actually working for an informant. And we understand how much they are conducting and what they want to do and the process of what they do it. So I want to offer to you, as citizens here across our nation, until we as U.S. citizens become familiar with what it looks like and familiar with reporting and not being afraid, do not be afraid to step out and say something. If you need to and you need to report it, you can do that anonymously. But please report it, because it just could be that one individual that is planning an attack, and you have changed that. You have made a difference, and you have protected everyone here and those around you. Similarly, as we know, in Israel and in the United Kingdom. Those citizens, those children know that if they found a backpack in the playground, they know exactly what to do. They've been instructed to then report it to a teacher. They know what suspicious activity looks like. They're not afraid to report it. We as US citizens need to overcome that. And that's our fear. What if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong? It's okay. You're not going to upset anybody, okay? You need to report this. And I implore you to keep your head on a swivel. Look around. So how do we protect ourselves, particularly this time when we're very concerned? A, reduce your own risk. B, improve your protection. And C, and above all, be hyper alert, be aware, particularly around areas that you know that could be terrorist attack targets in those areas, because we know individuals are looking at those locations. We just heard from the Central Intelligence Agency director that ISIS has US targets in the pipeline. Yes, they do. And very likely, not very likely, I can guarantee those individuals have surveilled those targets and have collected intelligence and are somewhere in that cycle, in that initial surveillance phase or that detailed surveillance phase. But at some point, to ensure that that location is the same as all that other, they need to be in that location. So it's imperative that all the eyes and ears that are on the ground in and around these locations, and that is you, identifying that suspicious activity, report it. So how do we report it? Well, as I'd said before, see something, say something. Virtually every law enforcement agency, whether it's federal, state, or local, has a web page in which you have the capability of going in and reporting suspicious activity. Also, there's other methods. If you want to remain anonymous, you can contact your local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, and they have the local Joint Terrorism Task Force, of which that information will go through. They will vet that information. They want this information. They need this information. They're relying on you. The local law enforcement want this information. They're relying on you as citizens to report this information. When we put this together, our citizens, with our non-security personnel, with our local law enforcement, with our state law enforcement, overarching federal law enforcement, together, collectively, we can prevent these terrorist activities from happening. We can prevent terrorism from hurting us and changing our lives. This is our new normal, ladies and gentlemen. Let's put our head on a swivel. Let's report. Thank you for your time.